Good morning. How's everyone doing? Can you hear me okay? Yes. All right. I moved the mic up nice and high, as instructed. But if you can't hear me at some point, just remind me to lift my voice up. Sometimes, when you're just thinking of something, your voice kind of lowers a little bit as you just kind of flow on there. That doesn't mean that when I'm loud, I'm not really thinking, but you know what I'm saying. It's very nice to see all of you. I've been very excited about lesson 3 here today and getting back to our class. Thank you for very much for all of your comments and all of the helpful resources and the suggestions and the things you want to learn and the things you want to talk about. I'm learning just as much going through this material and talking with each of you every week. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for being here again this morning. Albert Mohler wrote that it's our responsibility to think clearly, carefully, and critically about how our culture is being influenced and what this means for Christians seeking to live faithfully in our secular age. That's the focus of our class here today. Engines of culture. And before we get started, I've asked Brother Greg Gross to lead us in an opening prayer.
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, the freedom we have to come and worship you and learn more about your word. Please be with Josh today and help him to have a ready recollection of the things he's prepared and give him wisdom of the things that he's prepared. Help us to take these things in our minds and our hearts and take them into the world that we live in today. Please be with those that are sick and are hurting. Please be with those that are attending to them. Forgive us for our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.
Engines of culture. I'm really looking forward to the dialogue today. The quote, the theme kind of for our subject is, our responsibility is to think clearly, carefully, and critically about how our culture is being influenced and what this means for Christians seeking to live faithfully in a secular age. Just a reminder, those 2 red stars are for Brother David. He's going to be covering the next 2 weeks while we're traveling for the holidays, and we thank him very much for that. David, we're going to cover marriage and family, the biblical concepts of both of those subjects over the next 2 weeks. So then we can look at the impact of secularization on both of those from a biblical worldview and the perversion of marriage and the perversion of family in the secular age. The objectives for this class, just a reminder, to increase our understanding of the progress of American secularization, to do that through the lens of a biblical worldview in order to better arm and equip us, this congregation of saints, to achieve the ends of the Great Commission. Our reminders for the week: we as Christians are always ready to think clearly and biblically about difficult subjects. We're loving and thoughtful in all of our comments, and we always do our best to try to be empathetic, because we know that there are those, even in this congregation, even in the 4 walls of this building, who are impacted, if not all of us, by the moral revolution very deeply, and to people that we love, our family and our friends. All right, a couple key resources in the bibliography here. I bring this slide up again because I wanted to note the addition of the new resources to the list. As Brother Rocky brought up last week, we, as you remember, had a class on Christianity versus humanism just a few years ago here in the auditorium. That was the title of the book, Christianity versus Humanism. It was written by a brother from Montgomery, Alabama. Which will you choose? That was the name of the book. And we covered that material just a couple years ago in this class from Brother Robert Wagner. So Rocky brought that to my attention and reminded me about that. So we're going to start utilizing some of that in this week's class, in fact, right away. And then the other resources, a lot of these are from the moral revolutionaries themselves, as you'll notice from the title of some of these articles. So if you want some scary, nightmarish reading, go ahead and dive in. All right, any comments or questions before we get started this week? I know we covered the introductory material, right? I feel good about that. I feel good about how we've positioned this class and positioned the material for us to dive in more deeply. I think we're in a good place when it comes to the history of humanism through the years and how we got here. And I answer that question, we could spend we could spend an entire quarter on the history of that material, right? But I think we've covered it sufficiently enough and given attention to it sufficiently enough to get to where we need to be to dive in more deeply. All right. Reading from an article on the Christian Post this past week, this was just from Friday the 16th, the number of colleges and universities that have significant restrictions on free speech has increased, according to a new report from a free speech advocacy group. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression has released a new report on the state of free speech on college campuses. That report's titled Spotlight on Speech Codes 2023. The organization ranked nearly 500 U.S. colleges on the basis of a light system. Green light, meaning that the colleges have policies that do not seriously imperil free expression. Yellow light, meaning that the colleges have vague regulations on expression. And red light colleges having policies that clearly and substantially restrict free speech. According to the FIRE report, for the first time in 15 years, the number of colleges with the worst free speech rating has increased, as 12 colleges went from having a yellow light status to a red light status. We have people in college, right? Family members, sons and daughters in college today. Some of you have ran colleges. I hope your college wasn't on this list there, Mr. Zeiss. Some of you are getting ready to go to college, right? You should care very deeply about your ability to speak as you want to speak and express yourself as you want to express. I mean, we're bound by biblical law as Christians, right, in the way that we speak, in the way that we express ourselves. But nevertheless, you should care very much about your speech. Once those freedoms are taken, they're not coming back. A woman in Norway is facing up to 3 years in prison on criminal hate speech charges after saying that a man cannot become a lesbian. I'm reading from the New York Post. This article was just published yesterday. Tonya Gajivjan, a lesbian filmmaker and actress herself, was informed on November 17th that she was under investigation for speaking out against prominent Norwegian activist Kristin Jentoft on Facebook. Jentoft is a transgender female that often refers to herself as a lesbian mother. So this is a dialogue on Facebook. This isn't a one-to-one in-person dialogue. Jentoft previously accused another woman of transphobia for a similar claim. Ellingston is also under investigation and faces 3 years in jail if found guilty. The post on this Facebook page under investigation read, "It's just as impossible for men to become pregnant or for men to become a lesbian as it is for men to become pregnant. Men are men regardless of their sexual preferences." Gavovjan has said that she intentionally posted her Facebook message to draw attention to Norway's hate speech laws. 3 years in prison for that Facebook post. That's what this person, who herself is a lesbian, is facing. An article in the Jerusalem Post reads, "Over the last 2 weeks, a series of revelations about internal operations at Twitter, dubbed the Twitter Files, have provided an unprecedented look at how this major social media company makes decisions. A number of journalists have been putting out Twitter threads, getting the story out there. The files show how the internet has gone from being a largely free market to a heavily curated marketplace where people and algorithms try to amplify certain ideas and prevent others from spreading. The internal documents shed some light on important controversies in leading up to and after the 2020 U.S. election. More information is expected to come out in the coming weeks." Matt Taibbi wrote, "It is a Frankensteinian tale of a human-built mechanism grown out of control of its designer." Do you guys see these headlines? They're kind of hard to miss, right? I don't spend a lot of time watching the news. I can't do it. I don't spend a lot of time with those inputs all day long, 24/7 talking heads into my ears, into my eyes, into my brain. I can't do that, but I am aware of these headlines. I try to be educated, as we should, as Christians, be educated of the world around us. Any thoughts so far? I mean this to be apolitical. I don't mean to have any political leanings whatsoever in these articles. I just mean for these to educate us and give us the setting of the moral revolution. Yes, sir.
It shows you that truth is the greatest weapon against the dark side.
Yes.
And so the only way they can defeat truth is to shut it down.
Yes. Redefine truth, right?
It's
Tell us there is no objective truth. You have your truth and I have my truth. That's right.
Unless you shut it down.
That's right.
And it'll eventually get out anyway.
That's right. You can't kill the truth, and the truth doesn't care about what I think about it. It doesn't need my approval to live. But that's the entire concept of postmodernism, right? When we say the postmodern, post-enlightenment, moral revolution, that's what we're talking about, where truth itself is in question. And in a world that is like kind of an alternate reality, right? These aren't people talking to themselves face to face in this space. This is kind of like a meta world, if you will, another world in which we're talking to each other. We as real people, but it's not face to face communication. And in this case, in many cases, in this case in Norway, right, was a homosexual disagreeing with another homosexual about homosexuality and who can and cannot be homosexual. And the government itself, and we're going to look at the First Amendment, right, and our right to petition the government against our grievances. So the government itself is stepping in and labeling what we can and cannot say, and then dishing out jail time, which is the arm of the government to keep peace in a chaos versus order society, which we talked about last week. And by the way, Europe only precedes America in a few years in many of these cases. In the Scandinavian countries, they might be on the cutting edge of Europe, but they typically just precede the U.S. by a few years. I'm not trying to scare us, but it should scare us. All right, free speech. Let's quickly define a couple concepts before we go any deeper into the dialogue and the conversation. The question here is, what is free speech? Well, let's read the First Amendment for ourselves. This is the primary document itself, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Number 1. Or abridging the freedom of speech. Number 2. Or of the press. Number 3. Or the right of people peaceably to assemble. Number 4. And finally, to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So this is our founders' take on free speech. It's left here as a broad, inclusive concept. It's not something to be parceled out. It's not something to be more clearly defined. Not something to be contextualized based upon the political, social, and economic winds of the day. Along all those same lines, including in the First Amendment, as we just read, is religious liberty, freedom of the press, right of peaceful assemblies, and the right to petition government for grievances. That really sets the paradigm, if you will, that the government is in a posture to serve its population. It should continue to be in that posture in service to the people. So 5 important items there in the First Amendment. An article in National Review, and this article was published in 2017. So if you remember, this is the heat of the Antifa uprisings. This is the heat of what has been labeled the alt-right and that violence. That article wrote that the First Amendment is not merely an expression of liberal freedom, but of Republican freedom as well. And not the political party Republican, right, but in the sense of a republic, us being citizens of a republic. The liberal conception of liberty defines it as absence of government interference from your life. Whereas 20th century evolution, liberty means that the government is to provide a certain basis, a certain minimum floor of living. But the Republican notion of liberty is different. A free republic is one in which people are governed by laws that they themselves have a hand in the making. And from this perspective, freedom of speech needs to remain nearly absolute. For James Madison, free speech were not only natural rights, in other words, given by God, right? Rights that exist without the government's approval, without my approval. Truth, something objective. I remember last week when we covered believers believe in a being more powerful who can save us from our lesser selves. Natural rights given by God. And these natural rights are preconditions for self-government. What is free speech? That's what we're talking about. Okay, so this isn't actually James Madison in this picture. His portrayal in Hamilton was awesome. He was a great James Madison. But that's not actually James Madison. That might be who you think of. And if you've seen Hamilton, that doesn't get you off the hook from reading the Federalist Papers. You still got to read them. Or you just have to stand up in front of a bunch of people and pretend like you've read the whole thing. You can do that too. So in Federalist Paper number 10, Madison writes about the same subject that Alexander Hamilton himself picked up on in paper number 9. And their title is The Union as a Safeguard Against Domestic Faction and Insurrection. In this regard, the entire First Amendment, all the concepts including therein, those 5 points we read, comprise a broader concept that we would call public opinion or public good. In his viewpoint, they are essentially absolute to a Republican form of government, a republic. Madison writes, quote, there are again 2 methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. In other words, if you want no disagreements, no opposing factions, no opposing political parties among us, then we must either remove liberty at its root or grant the same liberties to all. Binary. It's a binary decision. Either the ruling party decides what we think, and there's no room to disagree, or every individual is free to think, feel, and act in accordance with their perceptions of the public good. Those are, according to the framer of the Constitution, written in the Federalist Papers, the safeguards against domestic faction and insurrection. The very worries that George Washington had in his farewell address. This is all political stuff from men, right? Political philosophies written by men. Men are fallible. We live in a sinful and fallen world. We're going to very quickly turn the tables to a biblical worldview here in just a second. What is tolerance? Tolerance is a loaded word these days. What's tolerance? Tell me what you think tolerance is. Not right or wrong, just what you think tolerance is, or what you think other people think tolerance is. Acceptance. Yeah, that's the first thing I expected to hear, right? Tolerance is acceptance, meaning you don't love me, right? Because tolerance can be equated to love for some people. So if you don't accept what I do, you don't love me. How can you be a Christian if you don't love me? God said to love everyone. Jesus loved everyone. Jesus wasn't a bigot. You're a bigot because you don't accept me and you don't tolerate what I do. Is that kind of like a summary of the moral revolutionaries' definition of tolerance? Our discussion in the First Amendment is very much related to tolerance. As I was putting together this lesson, and this speaks to the fact that we can all just continue to learn more and more about this. It's amazing to me how related, like how spider webby, if you will, these freedoms and liberties really are. We talk about the spider webbiness of sin, right? And how it jumps from one part to the other and grows like a cancer. The founders had such a deep understanding of human behavior and even morality at the collective and individual levels. Think about this. We have a greater ability to communicate than any generation before. And we have become more distant and perhaps less tolerant. Facebook has nearly 3 billion users. Is that a quarter of the world's population? That's what I read somewhere. I mean, the numbers are different depending on the year, but say a quarter of the world's population. With the ability to communicate, to connect and share information, only with the language barriers that were put in place at the Tower of Babel, which is pretty fascinating if you think about it. The objectives have changed from ensuring equality in the sense that everyone has a seat at the table, the same table, to excluding voices that are disagreeable. Moreover, excluding those voices that disagree with our perspective, the intolerant or the bigoted, as is sometimes said. A title of a recent article by Beatrice Albra is, "If we reject gender discrimination in every other arena, why do we accept it in religion?" For someone without a Christian worldview, that is a very good question. So here's the conclusion. You may not disagree with me. Not even under the protection of the First Amendment. Your speech and your religion may not disagree with me. Let's walk this out to the right to assemble, because the First Amendment's all connected. If the purpose for which you assemble is agreeable to me, even if those assemblies turn into riots and violence, it's no problem. First Amendment. If I disagree with your purposes for assembling, then you're nothing more than treasonous. Insurrection. Censorship itself, as we read just a few slides ago, has become standard practice by social media companies. We've learned that government institutions that are designed to serve us are providing direction on who to censor. Right, wrong, or indifferent, whatever that direction is, The idea of the First Amendment isn't the government censoring communication between individuals on platforms created by companies ran by those individuals. The government saying who needs to be, the government and private companies are deciding which voices need to be silenced, either openly or in the dark, which is a practice called shadow banning. There are some brave souls and organizations fighting back, energized with the themes of Hamilton's and Madison's essays. All right, here we go. What does that mean to me as a Christian? What does it mean to us as a congregation of Christians? That's why we're here today, to talk about this stuff. We as Christians know that human behavior has and always will be the same. We have to take encouragement in Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. This isn't new. It's scary. It's something that we have to battle against. It's something battling against us. And we as Christians dutifully have to battle against, using the armor of God. The Word of God, as we've talked about, the only offensive weapon on that list. But there's nothing new under the sun. We must take encouragement from that. That verse is so very prescient. It tells us that we're in troubling times, but not unique times. Though 21st century America culture is rebelling against God, that sadly has been the case with many cultures before. It'll be the case with many cultures after, until the Lord returns to this earth. Because we as Christians know that we live in a fallen world. And this world, my friends, cannot only be partially fallen. I think sometimes, I feel this way, sometimes I expect the world to be partially fallen. Right? Like, yeah, it might be fallen over there, but not where I live. It might be fallen for those people, but not in my home. It might happen to their kids, but not my kids. It might happen to him, but not me. It might happen in their marriage, not my marriage. Right? I expect the world to be partially fallen. The world is wholly fallen. The world is wholly lost. Everyone outside of Christ is lost. Romans 8:22 reads, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to present time. Within our lives, breathed into us by our divine creator, we are given free will. This is politics and Christianity, if you will, coming together in thought. That free will was not just partially given. Everyone has free will, Christians and non-Christians alike. This is why we have pain and suffering in a world created by an all-loving, all-powerful God. The baby is in the bathwater. It's why advocates of abortion believe that they're aiding the overall progress of humanity's arc. They believe that they're helping people. They believe it's better off for a baby to be killed than be introduced into the world, into the economic or social climate that baby is destined to enter. It's a genuine, sincere belief of helpfulness in many cases. It's why advocates of the LGBTQ plus movement genuinely believe that they're liberating an oppressed group of people. For them, progressiveness is removing oppression from humanity and moving humanity forward. They believe they're doing the right thing. It's why proponents of the so-called Respect for Marriage Act can, in their minds, tie together the protection of interracial marriages, overcoming sinful and completely unacceptable acts of racism, with the protection of a marriage of a man to a man or a woman to a woman, or any number of unions between the letters of LGBTQ and the letters to come, which is what the plus sign means. There are more letters coming. Biden's White House added IA to the end of that during their ceremony the past week. And then a plus. There are more letters after that. Because in a world with no truth, I can be whatever I want to be. In a world with tolerance as acceptance, you can't stop me. And the government's going to stop you if you try. All right, may I please ask for a volunteer to read a passage for me, please? Romans 8:18 through 28. Romans 8:18 through 28, please. And you can just go. Justin, thank you, sir.
For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption His Son, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose.
Paul gives the Romans their Christian worldview. These were people being killed in colosseums, right? Eaten alive by wild animals, burned by fires, tortured in all kinds of ways while multitudes cheered. This is their Christian worldview. They waited patiently for the hope that they have. I pray that we do the same. I pray that I do the same. There's such an encouraging scripture for us. There's so much we could take out of there. And we might do that in future weeks, but it pretty much summarizes the Christian worldview we should have in the moral revolution. What is culture? All right, so Engines of Culture, that's the title of this week's lesson. So let's define what culture means. Dr. Moeller describes it as an output of a vast array of influences, including language and traditions and fundamental worldviews. It's not static, it can change, and it can change fast. There was a term in the 1970s I've included here called future shock. I haven't heard of that before, but maybe you guys did when it was applicable, and not applicable, but modern, contemporary. It was often used to describe the fast-moving pace of American culture. Interestingly, in the decade that followed the sexual revolution, future shock describes the idea that humans are not capable of experiencing so much so fast. Too much change in a short time. Isn't that something you can just feel in your bones? I can't keep up. I can't keep up with hardly anything. Can't keep up with the fast-paced life, the growth of my kids, my job, the amount of time I want to spend in the Word, with exercising, with eating right, with the TV show I want to watch, the books I want to read, getting to church with all the church activities. I can't keep up with anything. Don't you feel it in your bones? Especially in the holiday season, like Brother Keaton's been talking to us about on Sunday mornings. Another important part of culture, let's remember that everyone contributes something. Those engines of culture that have particularly large impacts are producers of entertainment, media, clothes, technologies, and education. I don't know if we think about that last one being on the same list. We think about Hollywood, right? We don't think about our schools and our universities. The engines of production have become more and more political, and they're pushing hard in support of the moral revolution. The engines of culture are the intellectual elites, and they represent a far more radical view of America than we understand. These elites have targeted America's youth for decades. For many, to be modern, quote, would be to abandon a belief in God. Millennials, they haven't moved. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. They haven't moved to hard atheism or Gnosticism, right? They're really in a position of a great religious indifference. It's pens and pencils, right? Apples and oranges, as we talked about before. Secularization's impact is tremendous. Here's some staggering facts for us. 1 in 3 Americans are nuns. They claim that they have no official religious position. It was GLAAD's goal in 2020, GLAAD is the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, that 10% of TV characters be LGBTQ+. Their publicly stated goal is to shape the narrative and provoke the dialogue that leads to cultural change. That's exactly what we're talking about. There was recently an article by a very well-respected business publication, Harvard Business Review, right? The article is entitled, LGBTQ+ Inclusion is Good for the Economy. I'm sure most of you have seen the relevant disruptions within the Disney Corporation, right? An open struggle for identity inside a corporation with multiple activist employees who want to drive cultural change when their target market segment is parents with young children. Some professors at college campuses recently professed that they see themselves as, quote, agents of an ideological indoctrination. The New York Times proclaimed that a full-scale institutional commitment to undergraduate civic education involves creating a campus climate or culture that reinforces what students learn in their courses and extracurricular activities. The campus culture is a powerful source of socialization, even for commuting students. Christian colleges would write this so far, right? We believe the same thing. We believe that that's how we keep our children close to God. Students are socialized through their perception of the institution's norms, including peer norms, and their habitual participation in routine practices and communal events. We wouldn't disagree with any of that. That's the purpose of a university, to train up our children. But when more revolutionaries are at the helm, we need to be aware of it. 1 of every 8 Americans struggle with either an alcohol or drug disorder. 1 of every 8 struggle with both an alcohol and drug disorder, and 38% of Americans battled an illicit drug use disorder. We're going to cover addiction a few weeks from now. Any comments so far? Questions?
The schools, it was just this morning, I was reading an article about a teacher in Ohio. Now, I don't know what her religion was. I know she said this was against her religion. It didn't specifically state, but she had 2 students in her classroom who wanted to be referred to by different pronouns than their natural being. Right. And she refused and immediately took it to the principal or whoever was above her and said, hey, I've got this problem, how can we fix it? And basically they told her that she's had to refer to them as their pronouns with no other alternative actions like changing classrooms or referring to them by their last name or anything like that. And so when she refused, they just said, well, you need to resign. And so she did. But it's even something simple like that can have a big impact, and if we tolerate it, it's one more step down the path.
That's a great example. It's scary that it's in America and in Ohio, right? Ohio's not New York or California or Colorado, right? They're not far off on what we would call the liberal left. We had talked in week 1 about the case of the 14-year-old in British Columbia. Right? In Canada, again, they kind of follow Europe in terms of them being ahead of the U.S. and these kind of trends. But to hear an example like that right in the American heartland, if you will. Yes, sir.
We're doing a lot of talk about the symptoms of the problem, but I think we need to look at some verses in the Bible that tells us what the root causes of the problem is. Because all this really goes back to an age-old problem that we've seen over and over again. In the book of Judges, you find this phrase repeated over and over again, that there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And that's what this is. This is people providing ammunition. This is people providing a rationale for people to do whatever it is they want to do, so that in their mind they can feel justified for not serving God. I think another thing we need to realize is we can see the real world application of some of the principles we learn in our study in Revelation. Because in Revelation chapter 13, if we remember that, we've seen this vision of these 2 beasts. One coming up out of the water, which represented, civil government. Another one coming up out of the land, which represented, false religion, and that alliance of false religion with civil government. History is full of examples, and all we got to do is read our Old Testament, and we can see example after example of where false religion is aligned with government, and they each support each other. We were blessed for a time being where that wasn't the case in our country, because they saw the evils of that in Europe. They saw that with the alliance of the Roman Catholicism and the governments at that time, and then during the Reformation, people started pushing away from the Roman Catholic Church, and we started seeing independence of countries where they didn't want to be ruled by them anymore. And then in that vacuum, what we have is the secular humanism that's coming along, that's aligning itself with government. But the point is that alliance has been there for a long time, and we're seeing it showing more and more power. And some of the things you've talked about, is really, the struggle that they like to make everything out to be, that's Marxism. Whether we want to realize it or not, that's what Marxism is. He talked about it from an economic standpoint, but people have adopted that and put it in the social things where you got to have one group that's oppressed, you got to have another group that's being the oppressor. And so you're always pitting those together. And if we really stop and think about it, who was the first Marxist? It was Satan. What was the argument that Satan presented to Eve in the garden? God doesn't want you to eat that fruit because of why? It's going to make you wise like him. So what did Satan do? He put God in the role of the oppressor. Here's Eve the oppressed. Okay? God don't want you to be smart like he is. He's trying to keep you down. That argument works, and it continues to work today because that is the argument that's being used. I think what we have to be careful to not get into, and I'm not suggesting you're doing that, but we're making a lot of discussions about politics. I think we have to be careful to understand that the solution to the problem is not a political problem. Certainly governments are there. They're supposed to be putting what we might call guardrails to prevent people from doing evil things, and to the extent that they tear down those guardrails, they make it easier for people to do that, and that's what we're seeing in this country. We're seeing the access to different evil things being made easier and easier and easier by the government. That's what we're seeing. But the way you really change things, and a definition of culture that I learned at work, and I think it's real simple to remember, culture is the way we do things. Okay, so people are trying to change culture through all these different methods, through all these different public modes, through government. But when we read in the Bible, what do we read in Acts chapter 16, or chapter 17, verse 6, where Paul and Silas came to Thessalonica, and there was an uproar there, and what did they say about them? Here are these men that have come here that have turned the world upside down. They were changing the culture of the world. They weren't doing it through political means. They were doing it through the preaching of the gospel. And that's how we change people's hearts, because we are never, ever going to win in a political battle. Because one, people are aggressively fighting for their power. They want to hold on to that no matter what. Okay, so if you're coming at it from a political standpoint, they're automatically going to be against you because you're not them. But we work behind the scenes, one-on-one, by changing the minds of men, by changing their thinking, by what the Bible says. Because when people change, it doesn't matter what the law says. It doesn't matter if the law allows you to do whatever you want to do. As long as people's minds have truly been changed to the gospel and they're living in accordance with God's word, they're not going to be doing the wrong things. And that's where we need to be putting our focus in. I know you're going to talk about political things, and I understand that, but we need to understand that it's the politics that have turned the government, they're co-opting the government and using it to attack biblical views. But we don't fight them back in the same way. We fight them back by preaching and teaching the gospel on a one-on-one level, changing the minds of people one at a time. That's how we change culture, and we don't need to be deceived in thinking there's some other way of doing that.
Amen. I agree with everything you said, Rocky. I especially appreciate your call back to the Old Testament and Revelation and the two beasts. That's wonderful. And I hope that no one thinks I'm being political. As I said at the beginning of this class, this is an apolitical conversation, right? However, I would, if there is any disagreement, I would say that we live in the world that is very political. And we must find a way to navigate our way through those same waters. Politics isn't the way to heaven, right? God's word is the way to heaven. Jesus is the way to heaven, the one and only way to heaven. And we've covered that in our classes as well. But we must navigate the waters that we are sailing in, right? And the people who are fallen don't see the world as Jesus being the only way to heaven. So in a way, we must learn to talk their language. We must learn to live in a political world and tell them that Jesus is the way to heaven and that there's nothing new under the sun and that the Bible and the gospel is the way to salvation. That's why the gospel is the good news. Yes, sir.
our own example, the only one we live. I mean, 1 Peter 2:12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. In 1 Timothy 6:11, but as for you, O man of God, flee these things, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, gentleness. I mean, our challenge in this world is to live as Christ